It began with bullying and intimidation. There were political cartoons depicting the Chinese as pigs and as heathens. The U.S. government even took legal action against them, and anti-Chinese violence became commonplace across the West. The Washington Territory was no exception. When the factory whistle blew on November 3, 1885, Tacoma's leaders drove the Chinese out of town.
Well, it was not our finest hour as a city. The leaders of Tacoma, the mayor, the police chief, the prosecutor, basically the establishment, for the most part decided that it was time to expel the Chinese residents from our city. So they went down to the waterfront where many of them had homes, took them out of their homes, burned them to the ground, put them on trains, and told them to leave our city. It was a very sad, tragic event, and it's one of the reasons that Tacoma, for a pretty large city on the West Coast, does not have a Chinatown.
In the summer of 1885, there were as many as 700 Chinese that lived in Tacoma. By year's end, they were all but gone. Today, Tacoma is an international port city with a population of more than 200,000. And yet, there are still only about 700 Chinese that live here. To understand why means exploring the history of the American West and the Chinese immigrants who were part of it. The 1800s were turbulent times in southern China. The Chinese people were suffering. When word of the California gold rush reached Chinese ports, men began boarding ships bound for San Francisco.
In China, there were literally hundreds of years of problems that were taking place within the country. It revolved around everything from internal civil wars to the Opium Wars with Great Britain. There were problems with famine. A number of ports were ceded over to Great Britain. So the Chinese who had worked on docks and within the ports couldn't even get jobs.
There are lots of European and American ships in southern China already, and they bring news of the gold rush. And that's really how the gold rush became the gold rush. Everybody around the world heard about it.
In the early American West, when gold was discovered, it brought a huge influx of population from across the globe. Aside from the Native Americans who had lived here for centuries, everybody was a foreigner. If you were a Chinese individual, you were just one of many people, and everybody was a stranger in a strange land.
But the Chinese would quickly learn that in this land of opportunity, not everyone thought all immigrants were created equal.
When the Chinese began moving into the United States in the 1840s, 1850s, there are lots of public debates about slavery. This idea that God had even created separate races from the very beginning, that they were unequal.
History records the Chinese being viewed as the most foreign of them all. People looked at them as individuals who dressed differently. The way that they would wear their hair, they wore the queues. The way that they spoke, the language was clearly something that most people would not have any idea what was being said.
People felt that somehow the Chinese quality of life degraded everybody else, that their customs were unacceptable, they weren't Christian.
you get this population that it reinforces their foreignness because they're sticking to themselves. They're not, becoming Americanized and all this stuff. Well, how could they? So, and in addition, they were an easy target because they look different.